Cáca Milis opens with a shot of a train pulling into a station. We cut to a car pulling up with an old woman in the passenger seat and a younger woman, her daughter Catherine, the protagonist of the story, driving. The old woman seems distressed and asks why she is not here. The driver reassures her that she will arrive soon. The old woman becomes more distressed before Nora, presumably a nurse or carer, knocks on the window. Catherine prepares to leave the car, reassuring the old woman that she will return home in time for tea with the phrase "Nach me magoni," translated as "Am I not always?" but a more direct translation would be "Am I not living there?" or "Is that not my life?" She reassures her mother again, then exits the car and talks briefly to Nora about her mother before saying goodbye. Catherine notably does not say goodbye directly to her mother, nor does she involve her in the conversation. While she is kind when speaking to her mother, the impression given is that she is tired, frustrated even in having to care for her like this. Catherine walks into the train station and we cut to the title card. Cáca Milis, Sweet Cake. The next scene opens with Catherine sitting in a booth on the train reading a book. She glances out the window briefly and we see a blind man, our second player in this narrative, approaching the train. We hear over the announcement system that the train is going to Rosslare Europort, a seaport in the southeast of Ireland that is the primary passenger port for ferries from Ireland to mainland Europe or to the United Kingdom. We get a shot of the rest of the carriage, which, apart from an old man who seems to be dressed for a holiday, is empty. The blind man, Paul, and yes, that is Brendan Gleeson, makes his way into the carriage with some difficulty, and after dropping a small package on the floor, sits opposite Catherine.
Chocolate. Ban.
Paul puts his bag and cane in the overhead compartment, nearly hitting Catherine as he does so, before sitting down. We get a shot of Paul spreading his legs across to Catherine's side under the table and see him using his inhaler before he engages her in conversation.
Trasfaderota.
Couple of stapella.
Da me henne go konkursa. Da mer ser det. An Allah nacha.
During this conversation, we are shown that Catherine is reading an erotic novel. This, along with her general attitude towards Paul, is enough to establish that she would much rather be left alone than having to accommodate Paul on her journey. Paul takes his piece of Cáca Milis from a paper bag and rests it on the table before trying to engage Catherine in conversation again, this time about getting a coffee from the train trolley to go with his cake. There are a few points of interest in this brief exchange. Paul confirms what colour his cake is and expresses relief when the woman tells him, saying that they sometimes try to cheat or trick him in the bakery. He asks if Catherine would like a cup of coffee, and after she answers in the negative, reveals that he had asked not out of interest, but so that she would get him a cup if she was going for one herself. He continues this tack for a short while, specifically using his blindness to try and guilt Catherine into getting him a cup, before seemingly giving up as she ignores him and returning to his attempts at small talk. In this section of the conversation, Paul's motivation in conversing with Catherine is further developed, as his questions belie that his interest is not in what she has to say, but in telling her about himself. At times, he ignores her responses entirely and moves from asking questions to sharing his own experiences as the exchange goes on. We get several shots of the man's hands during the conversation, either twiddling his thumbs or fidgeting and moving the plate compulsively, small signifiers of his anxiety. And he breathes heavily throughout as well. Catherine continues reading her book, deliberately turning the page loudly as Paul continues. Rather than taking the hint, the multiple hints, he moves the conversation briefly onto her book before again returning the conversation to himself, this time on the severity of his asthma. Again, the woman tries to disengage from the conversation, but to no avail. And Paul takes the opportunity to brag about his experience being on the radio when he was younger. Paul shares another anecdote about how he has taken this train journey since he was 5 years old, and mentions that he can remember the entire trip off by heart. He then demands that Catherine ask him a question about what's outside the window. She obliges and he answers correctly. At this point, Catherine has attempted multiple times to end the conversation, and each time Paul has ignored her. And here, the story turns.
No.
Agus ceart fin noch?
Catherine smiles, seeing how her fabrication has distressed Paul. He has trapped her in this conversation, and she gets some vindictive pleasure out of her petty revenge. Her smile fades as Paul uses his inhaler and seems to calm himself somewhat as the coffee trolley finally moves through the carriage. Catherine reminds Paul to get his coffee, possibly feeling remorseful about her trick, or perhaps hoping that he'll quiet down once he gets it. As Paul gets his coffee and the server moves along, we get a brief shot showing that the only other passenger, the old man, is asleep. Back in the booth, Paul asks Catherine to put the sugar in his coffee for him, again citing his blindness making it difficult for him. When she ignores him, he begins to do it himself, huffing and sighing as he does so, before splitting a sugar packet over the table. Catherine glares at him. Whatever remorse she had felt before is gone again, and if there was any doubt, when Paul returns to the topic of the lake, she perpetuates her previous lie. Paul finally begins to drink his coffee and eat his cake, quite loudly and messily, disgusting both Catherine and us, the viewers, with some extreme close-up shots of his mouth as he eats and drinks.
Aerate it. Warm it up.
Arvada pista.
Under what?
That's a 10.
Catherine looks to the rest of the carriage for a moment before deciding to torment Paul once again.
Tug taste on. Feckin' taste on.
Hash.
Catherine describes the fake worm in detail to Paul, saying that it must have blended in with the pink of the cake, that it looks like it may have been bitten in half, that he must have eaten it already. We get extreme close-ups of her eyes, his mouth, back and forth, as if following her line of sight to the revolting image that motivated this cruel response. Paul begins to panic, and spits the cake out into his coffee. The train whistle cuts through the moment of tension, and Catherine begins to smile again. She's unrelenting, batting down Paul's refusal to believe her with vindictive pleasure. In a cruel irony, she is finally giving him the conversation he'd wanted earlier, only refusing to answer when she knows that silence will be more effective.
We'll check on torta. Call him inhaler, coach. Throw an inhaler.
Catherine grabs the inhaler and moves back in her seat as Paul begins to suffer from an asthma attack. Scrabbling for the inhaler, swiping the table clean in his desperate search. We see his distress, and hear as his heavy breathing, heretofore omnipresent in the scene, dwindles away into gasps, straining noises, and then silence. Catherine places the inhaler back on the table, just out of reach of his trembling hand, then rises from the seat and walks away. We get a final shot of Paul, neck extended, head rocking back and forth, desperately trying to breathe or call for help. We watch Catherine leaving the carriage as his hand falls limply into the aisle, punctuated with the screeching brakes of the train. Then, the final shot of the short film. Catherine walking along the platform before turning left to exit, and the train moving off into the distance, then turning right around a corner and disappearing from view.
Well, that just happened.